So I'm Alexa Arena. I run for Forest Cities, Northern California group. Forest City is a national urban development company, and we do specifically urban development, work in cities, work on large-scale private-public partnerships. We've been around for about 90 years. It started by the Radnor family, who has had a long love for cities and has since become a public company and is extremely innovative in the way they think, in the sense that they build at scale and they build to hold, which means they operate their properties and portfolios. That gives them a slightly different investment thesis than a lot of people who build and sell. And so when I came to Forest City, what really attracted me to them is that there was an opportunity there to really think about the life of cities and how you bring that as, whether we want to call it a product or just an environment, to people, and how you help facilitate connections. And so I started out with Forest City really thinking through what is the notion of open cities and how open cities are becoming a really relevant part of our lives. So I'll explain a little bit of that to you, and one of the prototypes we have, which is the 5M project, which started about 4 or 5 years ago. So fundamentally, I think real estate development, just to be self-critical or reflective for a moment, is really things very literally and very linearly. So we think about housing office, housing residential, housing specific uses versus housing the essence of connection and lifestyle that we're all after. And so when we first started the venture of really thinking about cities in a different way for the next generation, we started to say, okay, let's look back at history and how work has evolved and changed, and where it's been and where we are today. And so this, I'm not going to take you through this in depth, but it's a slide that kind of represents that for us, of kind of going through the history of the more industrial to the more Mad Men era, where you had the financial district, sort of glassy skyscrapers and suburbanization, over to the R&D campus, which was really about companies incubating ideas internal to their four walls. And then a much more sort of networked or kind of cafe environment that was a lot about third places being just areas for social interaction. And a lot of this was about mobility, which is all of a sudden you have the choice of where you want to work, and that really changes the face of real estate. And so those who don't think with that lens, I think, are going to be a bit of surprised and a step behind. And then to this next era of what is the reflection of a highly networked population. So what do I mean by networked? People who are connecting on Facebook, understand the value of sort of those spaces in between, and the value of relationships. So I know I don't have to go very deeply into this, because you guys spoke to Stephen Johnson, and he spoke to you, and I know I'm in a crowd that gets this way more than perhaps all of us did, because we didn't think that much about it 4 or 5 years ago, which is, what is the value of very different pieces coming together? As we get in an increasingly complex world, how do we have transparency to different worlds, and how does that help us spur innovation and spur growth? And fundamentally, what we're after here is those unseen connections and catalyzing relationships across boundaries and in between different environments. So when we did the user research for 5M, this kind of kept coming up on why people lived in this city and were willing to bust it out to the Google campus, where they said, look, I can ask my dumb ideas. I have transparency to friends in different industries. I'm able to get inspired by the city and bring that back to my work. And that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. And so the question for us is, okay, well, maybe we ought to think differently and think of real estate in the same lens. What if we designed with this in mind and took the incredible world of planning, but took it a step further, away from sort of just the linear thinking of how close am I to transportation, how much residential versus office do I want to build, et cetera, and went beyond the 5-minute radius of walking and said, what is that experience in between those connections, and really thought about what is great about the city, which is that we interact, the way that we want to interact is very much about serendipity, about collisions, about the surprise, rather than about the linearity of how we think of spaces. And this goes back to a world of, this is a quote from Jane Jacobs, which was one of my favorite people, and kind of talked a lot about cities as these areas of surprise, where you walk from block to block and you don't know what to expect, and that openness and that surprise and the intrigue and the creativity and the ability to confront different worlds that perhaps you don't want to all the time creates an ability to innovate and to think and to experience life in a very different way. So what we're really after here is building ecosystems, building networks versus building sort of the linearity of the built environment that exists now. And I think why this conference appropriately had Alex come speak to you is Alex is actually a very different hire for Forest City, who again often hires seasoned professionals who just worked with big companies and knows how to put together a retail or lifestyle center. Alex came from a world of really more of a sociological or psychological path. He founded, along that path, the hub in San Francisco. And the hub in San Francisco is the most successful hub in the world. For those of you who do not know the hub, it is very simply a co-working environment around social change. And let me tell you a little bit about the hub, and then I'll tell you how that worked into 5M. So when Alex went to build the hub, he was very much moved beyond the physical. So he created a co-working space, he opened the real estate and the physicality of it, but what he was really after is how do I catalyze a set of interactions? If somebody's not gonna work out of their garage or their home, why are they coming to a co-working environment? What are they after? And what do entrepreneurs need to launch their business? And he very much knew that was about human connections, relationships, sort of support networks, transparency to different freelancers, to consultants, et cetera, in order to be able to be successful, launch your business, create your ideas, et cetera. And so what he really ended up doing was, instead of putting his budget of marketing out there into the ethos, he created a menu of different events, and they scaled in size, and he designed the space, much like how O&A just described other spaces with a high amount of flexibility that could turn into event spaces at night and turn into all these different venues within the context of one box. They also did a partnership with the Intersection for the Arts. They have an art gallery space that's part of their space and so forth, which further cultivates creativity and sort of interdisciplinary thinking. And what ended up happening from there is that he really drove culture. And he drove culture from the bottom up by inspiring people who are part of the hub network to create their own physical environment and physical networks, which has resulted in, for the hub, about 1,200 members within the course of 2 years, 500 events, which means they're having an event almost every night, which is kind of remarkable to me. And as we think about real estate and place, what that does to a place. And about 20,000 different people who've touched the hub. So the hub in San Francisco has gone from being around entrepreneurs around social change to really being a very different type of place that instigates thinking, and you enter the hub, and there's no real way to describe this aside from going there, but you kind of feel it. You feel the cultural difference of being in the hub versus another co-working environment, and that's made it really take off. And since then, I've had friends who are attorneys who go work at the hub and are like, this is incredible, and want to work there a day or two a week. People who are Cisco employees, are employees of major IDEO, et cetera, the larger companies who just want to be around that environment and kind of networked with a community of very edge thinkers. And that's kind of what the hub has become about, and it keeps you constantly connected in a really easy way. So it almost lowers the transaction costs, if you will, of social exchanges. And so what we were after with 5M is saying, okay, across 4 acres, what does this look like when we move it up a level? And we frankly found the hub from a lot of research that we were doing, so our kind of thinking was intersecting with the hub, but we were a bit of a layer above, where we said, well, first off, we're not thinking of all the right tools when it comes to real estate. We're thinking very much around physical environments and architecture, and often, and we've been, as Forest City, known to do this as well, we get to creativity through Starchitects. What happens if we instead get to it through creating what the Bloomingdale's is for a retail center? Think of cultural anchors that help drive and facilitate distributed communities. And so the hub is one of those tenants at 5M. 5M, I should take a step back and say it had 200,000 square feet of empty space, of which we could fill and prototype while we were building the longer-term development plan for several million square feet of density on this site. And so we moved in the hub intersection for the arts, tech shop, off the grid for food, Square, who's one of our tenants, and all of a sudden started an incredible and robust amount of events and things going on at 5M, so it brought what was formerly the Chronicle, which was sort of a fortress because it was a newspaper and it kind of had to be, into this very open networked environment, and where it fundamentally is all about driving a certain density and diversity of experiences, where we were testing and seeing how do you create this open, flexible cultural environment, and how do you then design to that long term. So, whoops, this slide didn't quite come through. That was the civic spaces of 5M. I'm afraid this one isn't coming through either. So you won't quite see the design. But the long-term design basically took, let me go back a step, the principles of density, diversity, open, flexible, and so forth, and applied it to each of the different ways in which we thought of both the short-term and long-term design. So density of uses, of a mix of uses, diversity of those types of uses, and also the type of users that are on the site. We knew we wanted to build sort of the corporate headquarters of the future, but that actually had very little to do with just building for the corporation. It was about creating an environment that culturally people walk through, and they got onto an elevator that was much larger and had a coffee shop in it, or they walked through circulation space that was also art gallery space, where there was a certain openness to the environment that then helped them once they got into the incredible spaces that are much more about social experiences that O&A just showed us. And we created the sort of large floor plates, the contextual nature, in order to do that. And so there's a really strong sort of civic realm and a high concentration on the alleyways. Unfortunately, my remote doesn't seem to be working, so I'm going to have to ask you to go to a couple slides forward for me. One more. Perfect. So this is really what we're experimenting with today at 5M, which is very much about partnerships. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. Next Saturday, the site's being taken over by something called the Urban Prototyping Festival. The Urban Prototyping Festival is a partnership between lots of different entities, all of which are listed on the left. Intersection for the Arts, GAFTA, the Mayor's Office, Rebar, IDEO, and they're all coming together and crowdsourced with the community and got thousands of responses for, if you had a $10,000 budget, what would you create in a city to create connection between people, to create temporary spaces that allowed for that interaction. And they ended up reducing it down to 5 winners. Those people were in residence at 5M. Then they will show those different physical expressions during next Saturday, which is the UP Festival, as well as a lot of the different arts organizations and innovation-based organizations prototyping and showing what they're doing. And a lot of that for us was saying, we're not going to build the platform and the kind of software, if you will, that goes into how to create great cities and great environments, because it doesn't happen on a linear basis and it can't happen top down. It happens very bottom up. So what our job is to both figure out management and operation structures in order to clear the way for these types of things to happen, to cultivate the partnerships in the communities, and to design the spaces that really create the open and culturally rich environment that a lot of people are after and a lot of companies are after in order to be around and have their talent inspired by that and really bringing a different mentality to the workplace. And so that's what we see as really the value proposition of cities, the value proposition of our work, and where we're pushing forward. So I'm getting a couple signals on time, and I would love to open it up to questions.
We have about 5 minutes for questions. What's a question for Alexa?
Hi.
Is it a San Francisco thing, or is it happening all over?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I only have an opinion on this, of course, because 4 years ago, who knew that a lot of the 5M research was going to come to fruition? But if you look at places like New York, and there's many people in this crowd who can comment on this more specifically, but you're seeing the same thing that happened in San Francisco with SOMA taking over and outpacing the rents of the financial district. Why did that happen? And I think when we say why did it happen, there's two different answers usually. There's large floor plates, and there's also the culture of SOMA versus the culture of the financial district. So when we ask people about the financial district, why don't you go there? They kind of express this 8 to 10 of shoveling in and out of the elevator, 7 to 9, and everyone kind of looks like you, and there's a Starbucks at the base. There's no richness of the city fabric that made them inspired to be there. So it wasn't a great work environment. When you look at New York, the same thing has kind of happened, whether it's residentially that Chelsea is outperforming the Upper East Side, or whether it's that the downtown, as in the lower part of Manhattan, is outperforming the traditional financial district. So I think you're seeing these shifts in various cities, and we've had a couple of our different shops, if you will, or people in Chicago, Boston, et cetera, seeing these trends. And then you also see things like Austin start to take form, which Austin's this great example of, you know, a city that allowed South by Southwest to happen, that very much thought of the city as a brand through Keep Austin Weird. They attracted the talent, they became that magnet, and then the companies followed in an interesting way. Now, that's not the complete story, but there's something provocative in that kind of reverse equation. And I think those type of things are giving us a sense that it's certainly not a one-off.
What's the timescale for 5M in San Francisco?
Yeah, unfortunately, these projects take too long. But what's great is that phase 0's up, and so the experimentation kind of continues. And what I mean by that is the tenants are in, we're doing things like the Up Festival, et cetera, but it'll take about 3 years before the first phase gets in the ground.
When you say outperforming, what is your measure? What do you mean by that exactly?
Rents. So the rents are higher. Yeah, it's a fairly crude measurement, but, and also if you look at vacancies, the same thing.
It seems the common theme is kind of the shift away from the financial centers, which are tall, lifeless kind of skyscraper buildings. And so what, have you got any thought of what is the future of the financial centers? I mean, how are those going to continue to live?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we can all bet that you don't go to the office for the heads down work. And when you look at the floor plate of the financial district buildings, the problem is it was built for the secretaries on the interior and then the CEOs or the C-suite on the exterior, so enclosed offices. So what's happening with the future workplaces, it's much about cultivating social interactions. You know, the users have been teaching us more than the development community, certainly, in how to create those. And so what we're seeing is bigger floor plates that can fit a lot of the programming O&A just went through of how do you facilitate internal interactions. And then I think a broader environment where it's mixed use, so you have more 24-hour activity, and where the civic realm goes beyond open space. And it's about a series of shared spaces and shared environments, and also some of these network-based users like the performing arts and intersection and, you know, the hub, et cetera, who are constantly running events that make it really easy for talent to tap into and then go back up to the workplace and be inspired by. So it's about kind of creating the maximum amount of serendipity that you can, and that's a lot of how we're designing the civic realm.